Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we are diving into one of the most shocking events that has taken the world by surprise, the massive protests in Moscow against Vladimir Putin. Millions of people flooded the streets, demanding change, voicing their anger, and calling for justice. The scale of this uprising is unprecedented in recent Russian history, and the world is watching every moment with bated breath. What started as a protest quickly escalated into something far more dramatic than anyone could have predicted, leading to a collapse that shook not just Moscow, but the entire nation. The protests began early in the morning, with crowds gathering at the city's main squares and avenues. From the Kremlin walls to Red Square, people poured in from every corner of the capital. The streets were filled with chants, banners, and a palpable sense of anger. Citizens from all walks of life joined together, united by a shared desire to challenge a regime that many feel has grown increasingly authoritarian. The energy was electric, the mood tense, and the message clear: the people of Russia are demanding accountability. Social media quickly became flooded with videos and live streams of the protests. Images of massive crowds packed tightly into Moscow's streets circulated worldwide, showing just how many people were willing to take a stand. These images shocked international observers who had underestimated the scale of public dissatisfaction in Russia. For many, the protests were a sign that the status quo might no longer hold, that the government could be vulnerable in ways previously thought impossible. Despite the massive numbers, the initial days of protests were surprisingly peaceful. There were chants, speeches, and even moments of celebration among the crowds. People waved flags, held signs, and made their voices heard. Yet, beneath the surface, tension was mounting. Security forces were on high alert, patrolling key areas, and monitoring the growing crowds. The atmosphere was a mix of help and apprehension. People were determined, but there was also a looming sense of danger that something could go wrong at any moment. Then, the unexpected happened. As the protests swelled in size, an unforeseen collapse occurred in a central part of the city. Reports describe a sudden structural failure in one of the key urban areas where the protests were concentrated. Panic erupted immediately. Thousands of people scrambled to safety as chaos ensued. What had been a powerful demonstration of solidarity suddenly turned into a scene of confusion and fear. Witnesses later described the moment as surreal, almost like time had stopped as the crowd tried to comprehend what was happening. Emergency services rushed to the site, working tirelessly to rescue those trapped or injured. The scale of the collapse meant that the response had to be rapid and efficient. Hospitals were put on high alert, and authorities called for calm amid the chaos. Social media posts showed both the fear and the bravery of the people caught in the collapse, with many risking their own safety to help others. The images were haunting, yet they also highlighted a sense of unity among the citizens, even in the midst of disaster. While the collapse captured global attention, the protests did not immediately dissipate. In fact, in many ways, it strengthened the resolve of the people. The event became a symbol of the fragility of the current system, a stark reminder of how unexpected events could change the course of history. Demonstrators used the moment to amplify their message, calling not just for reforms but for accountability and transparency from the government. Every corner of Moscow seemed to be involved, from student groups to workers, from young activists to older citizens, all demanding that their voices be heard. International media were quick to cover both the protests and the collapse. Analysts debated what this meant for Putin's administration, speculating about the political and social implications. Some suggested that this could mark the beginning of a significant shift in Russian politics, while others warned that the government might respond with increased force to suppress dissent. Regardless of the predictions, one thing became clear: the people of Moscow had made history, and the world could not ignore their collective voice. On the ground, the mood was a mixture of fear and determination. People who had been caught in the collapse continued to participate in smaller demonstrations and gatherings, refusing to let the incident intimidate them. Interviews with protesters revealed a deep-seated frustration with the current state of governance, economic pressures, and a desire for a more open society. Many expressed hope that these protests would spark broader change not only in Moscow but across Russia. Government officials initially tried to downplay the scale of the protests and the severity of the collapse. Statements emphasized that the situation was under control and that normalcy would soon return. However, these messages were met with skepticism both domestically and internationally. The sheer number of participants and the widespread media coverage made it impossible to conceal the reality on the streets. Citizens were determined to make sure their voices could not be ignored. The collapse itself raised numerous questions. How could such an event occur in the heart of a major city? Were there underlying infrastructural weaknesses that had been neglected for years? Experts began analyzing the incident, and preliminary reports suggested that the area had been under significant strain, both from the sheer number of protesters and from underlying structural vulnerabilities. This added another layer of concern to the already tense political situation, highlighting not just social unrest but also physical vulnerabilities in key urban centers. As the days progressed, the protests evolved. While the initial gatherings had been spontaneous and largely uncoordinated, more organized groups began to take shape. Leaders emerged, using social media and underground networks to coordinate marches, rallies, and public statements. Messaging shifted from purely anti-Putin slogans to broader calls for political reform, freedom of speech, and accountability. The movement began to gain momentum, showing a level of organization that surprised even seasoned observers. The world watched as Moscow became a focal point for discussions on civil rights and government accountability. International leaders issued statements urging restraint and dialogue, emphasizing the importance of peaceful protest. Meanwhile, citizens continued to face a delicate balance between exercising their right to demonstrate and ensuring their own safety. The lessons of the collapse remained fresh in everyone's minds, influencing how people moved through the streets and how organizers planned subsequent events. Economically, the protests and the collapse had immediate consequences. Stock markets reacted nervously to news from Russia, and international investors began to reassess the stability of the region. Local businesses in Moscow faced disruptions as crowds filled the streets, and transportation networks were temporarily halted to ensure safety. Yet, despite these challenges, the spirit of the protesters remained resilient. People were determined to continue, showing that their message mattered more than temporary inconvenience or fear. Social dynamics also shifted during this period. Families, neighbors, and friends who might not have participated initially found themselves drawn into the movement, either by witnessing the protests firsthand or by seeing the aftermath of the collapse. Community groups mobilized to provide aid, first response assistance, and logistical support. The collective response was a testament to the resilience and solidarity of ordinary citizens in times of crisis. Authorities were forced to rethink their strategy in the wake of these events. Security measures were increased, but heavy-handed tactics were balanced against the risk of further escalation. Some officials attempted to engage with protest leaders, proposing dialogue and negotiations. While these efforts were met with mixed reactions, they indicated a recognition that ignoring the movement entirely was no longer a viable option. The government had to acknowledge both the scale and intensity of the unrest. Amidst all this, stories of individual courage and heroism began to emerge. People risked their lives to help strangers caught in dangerous situations. Medical professionals worked tirelessly to treat the injured, and volunteers coordinated resources for those affected by both the protests and the collapse. These personal narratives added depth to the larger story, showing that even in moments of chaos, humanity and compassion could prevail. The psychological impact on the citizens of Moscow was significant. Witnessing both mass protest and sudden collapse left many feeling a mix of fear, anger, and determination. Mental health professionals warned about potential trauma, while community groups stepped in to provide support. The experience was transformative, making people more politically aware and more engaged with the issues affecting their country. International reactions continued to pour in. Governments around the world debated sanctions, expressed concern, and monitored the situation closely. Analysts predicted that the events in Moscow could influence not only domestic policy but also Russia's foreign relations. The combination of mass protest and infrastructural failure made headlines everywhere, ensuring that the situation remained at the forefront of global attention. As weeks passed, the movement showed signs of endurance. Despite fatigue and fear, citizens continued to organize, strategize, and demand accountability. The collapse remained a pivotal moment, often cited in speeches, interviews, and social media posts. It became symbolic of both vulnerability and resilience, a reminder that even the most powerful systems could be challenged when people united. The international community began to take a more nuanced view of the situation. While many condemned potential government crackdowns, others focused on the reasons behind the protests, analyzing long-term economic and political pressures. This global scrutiny put additional pressure on the Russian administration to respond thoughtfully, even as internal debates over strategy and control intensified. In Moscow, life began to adapt around the protests. Streets were restructured for safety, local authorities coordinated with volunteer groups, and citizens became more proactive in protecting themselves and others. The movement took on a life of its own, evolving beyond simple demonstrations into a broader societal shift. Ordinary people became leaders, organizers, and symbols of change, illustrating the power of collective action in shaping history. The collapse itself has since been studied extensively. Engineers, urban planners, and political analysts examined both the immediate causes and the broader implications. Findings suggest that the event was a perfect storm of social, political, and infrastructural pressures. It served as a stark reminder that large-scale civic engagement can have consequences beyond just political messaging, influencing the very fabric of a city. As the narrative continues to unfold, one thing is certain: the people of Moscow have made a statement that will be remembered for years. Their courage, determination, and resilience in the face of both government resistance and unforeseen disaster reflect a profound shift in public consciousness. For many around the world, these events serve as an example of how ordinary citizens can challenge power structures and demand accountability. Even as tensions remain high, there are signs of hope. Dialogue, both formal and informal, has begun to emerge. Citizens are working to ensure that their voices continue to be heard, advocating for reforms and increased transparency. While the path forward is uncertain, the events in Moscow have demonstrated the potential for change when people unite, face challenges head-on, and refuse to be silenced. The story of these protests and the collapse is far from over. Every day brings new developments, new narratives, and new opportunities for understanding the complex dynamics at play. Observers both inside and outside Russia continue to watch closely, learning lessons about civic engagement, governance, and resilience. The echoes of these events will resonate for years, shaping the course of history in ways that are only beginning to be understood. Ultimately, what happened in Moscow is a powerful reminder of the strength of the human spirit. Millions of people came together to demand change, faced unexpected disaster, and yet continued to push forward. Their courage, unity, and determination are not just a story for Russia, they are a story for the world. And as we watch, learn, and reflect, one thing is clear: the events in Moscow will be remembered as a turning point, a moment when ordinary citizens proved that their voices truly matter.